live video.
Good evening, everybody. I just wanted to take a little bit of time to shoot a quick video on how to do machine binding. This is a topic that comes up quite often in my classes, and just this last week I've done 3 in-person tutorials on how to do binding on your completed quilt tops. So I have a baby quilt here that I quilted today, and I'm going to use it as the demo to put the binding on. So before we get started, I've already made my binding. I cut 2.5-inch strips, and for the purpose of this video and this baby quilt, I've done straight binding, so I've cut straight strips. And they're 2.5 inches, and then they're already pressed in half, and so I've got it ready to go. I'll do another video later on how to cut bias binding and then put those bias tails together to create your bias binding, and do a little bit more in depth on bias binding. But for tonight's video, I'm going to show you how to attach this binding to your quilt. So this quilt is a baby quilt, and I have pieced it and quilted it. And so I've got a few little basting stitches in here. I'm going to leave those in there because my binding is going to cover those basting stitches. But if they were a little bit further over, I would probably just pull them out and get rid of them. But for the purposes of this video, we're just going to leave them in here. Now, so since this is a pieced quilt top, I typically will bind my put the binding on with my machine onto the front side and turn it to the back side and then hand sew it down. Okay, if I was going to use my machine to do both sides of the binding, I would sew the binding to the back side of the quilt and turn it to the front side and then top stitch it down with my machine. I am going to put this one on with machine on both sides. So I'm going to flip this over, and we're going to put it to the back side, and then I'm going to top stitch it down with on the front side. So the first thing you're going to need is, I like to use just a little small 6-inch ruler. This is my tried and true method of how to put the tails together at the end. So since this binding is 2.5 inches, 2.5-inch strips, we are going to take this ruler and we're going to divide that number in half, and we're going to go 1.25 inches. And so I'm going to take this ruler and I'm going to lay it on there, and I'm going to mark with a pen my 1.25 inch mark, just like that, right there. So I've got that as my reference point. And it doesn't matter what size of binding you use, always divide the number in half. So if you use 2-inch binding strips, then of course your reference point mark would be 1 inch. So since this is 2.5, my reference point mark is 1.25. So I don't ever start binding at that pin. I usually put a couple of pins in because I want to leave myself a tail so that when I come back around, I can unpin these pins and have room to work and put my tails together. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to put another pin, and this is about where I'm going to start stitching, is at this 3rd pin here. So you see I've given myself probably about 10 or 12 inches there before I start stitching. I'm going to start stitching right about this 3rd pin. So I'm going to come into my machine and I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to slide my quilt sandwich under there at that pin. Pull my pin out. Do a locking stitch, and I'm going to start sewing the binding down. Okay, we're coming up on this corner. We're going to stop stitching about 1/4 of an inch from the end. I'm going to back stitch and do a couple of locking stitches, and then I'm going to pull it out from under there, and I'm going to snip my threads, and then we're going to miter this corner. So we've got our binding coming off. We've stopped 1/4 of an inch from the end. We didn't stitch all the way to the end. So now we're going to take this binding tail. We're going to do a 90-degree angle just like that. We're going to pull it up, and we're going to make a fold over even with the edge of the quilt sandwich edge there. Now I'm going to stick a pin in it right there to hold it in place. We're going to come back under, and this is what this right here is what creates the mitered corners for you. I'm going to stick it under there. Now I'm going to back stitch all the way back to the beginning off the edge there, just like that. Now we're going to zip this all the way around the quilt here. It's a nice small baby quilt, so it shouldn't take me but just a couple of minutes to zip this binding. Okay, we're coming down to our next corner. So just to repeat, we're going to stop stitching 1/4 of an inch from the end. I'm going to do a little locking stitch right there. Pull my needle up, pull it out, snip the threads, come back, 90-degree, fold over even with the sandwich edge, stick a pin in it, and pull out my pin. Back all the way off the edge. So just so you can see that where I backed back up to the edge and then came back forward to start, just kind of locking those stitches and going back off the edge and coming back on. Thank goodness for a nice fast little sewing machine to zip this binding on pretty quickly. And now we're coming up on our next corner. Okay, gonna pull up the fabric, make that 90-degree angle there, fold it over, stick a pin in it, making sure it's lined up with my cut edge of my quilt sandwich there, and that it's straight across the edge of the top of the quilt sandwich, just to give you a few more little details there. Okay, we got one more this side to do and around the corner, and then we should be on the home stretch to put our tails together. Okay, coming into our final mitered corner here. Okay, so now you can see that this is the last mitered corner that we have, and we're coming into the home stretch to our tail where we began. So I'm going to miter this corner, and then I'm going to come in and I'm going to quit stitching somewhere about right here so that I can give myself enough room to work and attach these two tails. So I'm gonna quit stitching about 8 to 10 inches before I get to the beginning of where I started. So I'm going to miter this corner. Oops, sorry. Trying to take the cameraman out here. Okay, I'm getting really close. I'm going to stitch to about right here where my finger is. Back stitch, lock those stitches, and pull it out. Okay, here comes the fun part. This is the part that gives the people the most issues, is how to know when to cut your binding tail and how to put the two ends together. So we have this pin in here marked as our reference point at the beginning. That was 1.25 inches. And so I'm going to bring this tail coming from the other way, and I'm going to lay it over the top of that. I'm going to pick my ruler back up, and I'm going to lay my ruler at that pin at the end where we marked 1.25 inches. Now we're going to go 1.25 inches past the pin, just like this. So there's my 1.25 inches past my beginning pin. So this is the tail coming from the top back to meet the tail at the beginning. So where I've marked this with a pin, I'm going to take and I'm going to cut it with my scissors. So that's where you cut your tail. So now we're ready to put the two tails together. So I'm going to take out these pins where I started. Okay, so got your quilt laying up here. We need these two ends to have working room here to be able to put them together. I don't have my iron on tonight, so I'm going to use my little roll and press tool to kind of roll over the seams and then to flatten out the seams and then fold the binding back over. So, okay, so we got this tail coming in from the top. We got this tail from where we started at the beginning. So we're going to take and we're going to open up the tail where we ended. We're going to unfold it just like this. I'm going to lay it out here on the table so you can see. Now we're going to take this tail from the very beginning and we're going to open it up, and we're not going to twist it. We're not going to turn it. We're just going to kind of move it over, and we're going to put the right sides together just like that. Now, we want to create a bias connection here, and so I just barely go just a little bit above the fabric with this tail here so that I can know where to stitch that diagonal seam. So I start in the little V-notch right there where my finger is, and I want to come off in the V-notch right here at the bottom. So to help me keep that in place, I'm just going to stick a couple of pins. I'm a big pinner. I believe in having everything pinned. So now I've got those pinned in place. I'm going to come in and I'm going to stitch a diagonal line starting up here at the top all the way down to the V-notch down at the bottom. So the easiest way for me to be able to tell you how to remember which direction to stitch that line, that diagonal line, is we're going to cut off the excess fabric. So we got to be able to cut off the outside. So you can't stitch it this way because then you're cutting into your strip if you sew your diagonal line this way. So you got to sew it this way, and then we'll cut a 1/4 inch seam allowance over from the stitch line and cut that piece off. So I'm going to stick this under here, under my foot. And this is why you give yourself enough room, is to be able to do this. So I'm going to pull my threads out. I'm going to lay that V-notch right there in front of my needle. My needle's right there in that V-notch where I'm starting. I don't have to draw a diagonal line because I can eyeball it just like that. It doesn't have to be 100% straight, but as you can tell, it's pretty straight. And these pins are extra fine pins, so yes, I did just sew over the top of them. So there's my stitch line. So now we're going to measure 1/4 inch past that, and we're going to cut that excess fabric off right there. So I'm going to just eyeball it. I'm going to cut this little tip off right there. Going to cut this little smidge off right there at the top to make them straight. So now there's my little, I'm going to lay it down so you can see it up under the light. There is my seam. So now I'm going to open that up. I'm going to open that seam right there. And this is where I'm going to press it with my little roll and press tool. Just like if I was finger pressing it. Just kind of flatten it out. So now I can fold that bias binding back up just like that. That seam's going to lay flat without me having to go and press it with the iron. Give it a little press with my roll and press. And as you can tell now, my binding is now ready to stitch from up here where I quit stitching all the way down here to where I started stitching. And if you look at this, it comes out perfect. There's no excess bonding, the two tails are put together, and you have exactly the amount of bonding that you need without any excess looping in there. So now you just slide it back under your presser foot where you stopped. And you just continue on. There's my beginning. I'm going to go back, block stitch. Ta-da! Your bonding is now attached. Your tails are perfectly put together without any bonding tool or any extra tools to purchase to do bonding. That method just puts the tails together and just makes it come out exactly perfect. Okay, so now I'm going to show you real quickly what I do to top stitch it. So like I said, we put it onto the back. I'm going to sew this down with my machine instead of doing hand stitched bonding. So we did the opposite. We sewed it to the back. We're turning it to the front. So now we have the mitered corners on the front. So you do them just like you would do if you were doing it from the back side. We're going to be covering that stitch line where we attach the bonding. So there's my first perfectly mitered corner where the seams intersect right there. You have the diagonal seam. I'm going to go ahead and drop a pin in there. Just like that. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to start going down, so I'm just going to go ahead and stick a pin up here and kind of hold that in place. And I'm going to go ahead and drop a pin in here just for the video purposes so I can kind of hold it together. Normally I just do it with my fingers as I'm starting. So we're going to put this under the machine. I'm going to go ahead and take that pin out that's in my mitered corner there. And I've got the edge of my bonding lined up right straight with where my needle is going to be going. So that's going to be my stitch path. I'm going to be trying to stitch right along the very edge as it goes right up in that V notch of my foot there. So I'm going to stitch just a little bit further and then I'll come back and show you. Get this pin out of here. Okay, so now you can see that I have stitched just right along the very edge of that binding and top stitched it down. I'll do this all the way around. I'll do a little stitch out in that miter when I come back around to it, and as I do each one coming around. And then you see that I'm using the same color of thread as I'm actually using the same binding on the quilt as the backing, and so I'm using a white thread to top stitch it down because that's the color of that bonding and it's also color of the backing. So you see my stitch line is coming in right here along beside my bonding, but it blends in perfectly with the backing fabric. So you won't even see it. It'll just look like the stitching in your quilting. So I'll cut those tails off of my thread there, and we will continue on top stitching this down. I'll go to one more mitered corner to show you how to do the corners, and then we'll wrap up this video. I will also try to get this video posted to my YouTube channel. So if you don't know about my new YouTube channel, it is The Quilted Cowgirl on YouTube. You can go and subscribe to it, and I will be trying to post some of these videos like this out there. So if you need to go back and reference them over and over, you can. And you see I'm got my basting stitches in here that we talked about earlier. I can just grab those and pull them out like that, or I can just simply fold over the fabric just like that and it'll hide them. So there's really no need to pull them out, but if you're OCD like me, then you can pull them out. And these threads that are up in there, I just kind of take my fingers, glide them up in there, lay them up in there, pull the fabric over. Go ahead and trim off these tails right here at the corner. Okay, so we're getting close to coming into a mitered corner. So I kind of start prepping before I stitch all the way down there so that I can get this corner mitered perfectly. So there's my mitered corner. So I'm going to stick a pin in it to hold it so I don't have to sit there and hold it and try to guide my fabric too. Okay, I'm right on top of my miter, so I'm going to raise my presser foot on my machine, pivot my fabric. I'm going to pull out that pin, stitch a few stitches toward me in that miter, go back, realign, pivot, and now we're ready to start stitching the straightaway again. And now you can see there's how I secured that mitered corner with a few stitches right there. And then I'm staying right there on the edge of the inside of that binding to tuck it down. And I'm staying right there alongside the binding on the back. Makes beautiful binding put on with the machine. So, thank y'all for watching. That's my binding video for tonight. And if you need to go back and watch it over and over, I'll try to get it posted to my YouTube channel so that you can view it as you need to. Thanks, guys. Have a great evening.